Albert Einstein said no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it in the first place. If you're wondering about this painting, it's the only abstract painting I ever did, and it was inspired by my dad's OCD and fear for HIV. Material scientists like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker and Dan Dennett used to be my intellectual heroes. In fact, I went through the whole evolutionary biology, psychology, neuroscience phase where, the God Delusion was really my favorite book at that time. It opened up my second eye. It was one of those rare moments in my life where I remember it just sort of feel like I was awakened for the first time, and that book really, transcended my thinking into the next tier. But I've come to realize recently, after more peeling of this onion to get to the core of reality, that was only the beginning. That was only the tip of an iceberg of how far you can go down the rabbit hole. And I'm kind of surprised now that thinking back on it, how a lot of people, how they can be sort of blind to the trappings of scientific materialism and its paradigm and its matrix. And, I'm going to break that down later in the video. But I was amazed at the power of logic and reason and got mad at anyone who believed in anything outside of reason. But those people who claim reason to be the gateway to truth rarely question the reason behind this reasoning. See, reasoning is so tricky because people use reason to reason about their own reasoning. So it's like this reciprocal circular feedback loop, a snake biting its own tail that you can never escape from unless you get out of reason and be trans-rationalizing your way to truth. And people who declare faith to be the enemy of reason haven't realized that it takes passion to rationalize and faith to believe in reason. See, a lot of people who think reason is this cold-blooded, objective, quote-unquote, knife that they can cut through reality with, they take that on blind faith. That what made them think that reason is the gateway or the only pipeline or the number one tool to dissect reality. And for a lot of those people, they use reason to justify their emotions after the fact. See, that's why you see those people who are debating each other and they're like, oh, I'm using reason. Look how reasonable I am. But they're saying that after the fact that their ego is trying to sort of justify itself by using reason to prove itself to be reasonable. And that drive, that motivation is passion and emotion. So reason and emotion can never be taken apart. Even Einstein, when he said that after he balanced out an equation, it's almost trans-rational. He feels a sense of awe and sense of aesthetics. And he refers that to receiving insights from the divine. Another trapping of reason is that people use reason to do all kinds of horrible things. Hitler was reasonable from his perspective. He used logic to do what he did. And same with a lot of other criminals. And lawyers could defend anybody, even the bad guys, using reason and win the case. What if paradoxes is the bedrock of reality, and the universe includes all possible contradictions precisely because it's infinite? And if you have an access to absolute infinity, if you connect to the source for even just 1 second, you'll see that reason and logic and rationality is such a small spectrum of the mind. In fact, the whole intellectual capacity of a human, the whole intellect, the whole human mind is such a small slither of the infinite possibility that is reality, that is your consciousness, that it's really absurd to just hang on to that one little slither and be like, this is the only gateway to truth. And perhaps reducing the infinite nature of reality into one equation that you can put on t-shirts, which is what most scientists spend their whole career trying to do, is to trying to find that theory of everything, right? Einstein failed. And that gesture is really pretty arrogant. That gesture of thinking that you can reduce the whole universe into one equation, one main equation, it's just as crazy as thinking that the whole universe was created by one bearded old man in the sky who judges you. And maybe the conviction in an objective material reality is as baseless as the religious fanatics' belief in the supernatural. And the cradle of a mind-independent reality depends on nothing other than a human mind. So this is where you see the fundamentalist Christian and the atheist, they really have a lot in common. That's one main reason why they always get into arguments. And if you see the debates on TV or on YouTube, if you just mute the video, you see how they're just mirroring each other in terms of their emotions, the way their egos are triggered. Because they're standing on two opposing ends of the spectrum, but what happens when two opposing spectrums are pushed to the extreme? They come full circle and they meet. See, on one side of the extreme, you have the fundamentalist Christian who derives his entire belief under this assumption that the essence, the underlying essence of reality is the one man, the bearded man in the sky. And on the other side of the extreme, you have the material scientist, the atheist, who also takes it on blind faith that the entire structure of reality is arising from this thing called matter, this objective physical object that you can study apart from consciousness. And that is just an assumption. Because what really is matter? If you vipassanalyze everything down to the microscopic level, matter is nothing more than an arbitrary term that we use to coin certain types of sensations. See, anytime an organism interacts with his environment, he has sensations, right, imprinted on his consciousness. And different sensations come in different intensities and degrees and volumes. And we sort of categorize certain types of sensations as quote unquote matter. And we categorize, using language, other types of sensations as mind, or as immaterial, as physical, or as mental. But at the fundamental structure of reality, when you vipassanalyze everything down to the microscopic level, that duality dissolves, it collapses. Where's that line? Again, where's that line between matter and non-matter? Between the mind and the body? Between the physical and the non-physical? It collapses, it doesn't exist at the deepest structure of reality. And you can access that deepest structure of reality, and it's called consciousness, through consciousness work. Which is what a lot of those material scientists are missing, which I'll explain in more details towards the end of this video. What most material scientists get backward is that their starting point, they derive all their experiments and discoveries and assumptions from this presupposed underlying essence of matter, when in fact, the underlying essence is consciousness. And this underlying matter is just one context out of many other contexts, one meta matrix out of many other categories of matrix that science is sort of trapped in, science derives its conclusions from. So all scientific discoveries are context dependent. It's never absolute. It's always relative. Relative to what? To those contexts. And what are those contexts relative to? Relative to the human mind. Again, going back to the human mind. Context can also be tools of measurements or the framework of, like we said before, human reasoning and certain mathematical formulas, which are, again, mind dependent. The result of scientific discoveries conforms only to those contexts, to the methods of the experiments and the particular instruments used to carry out the measurements, which are, again, man-made instruments and mind-dependent. See, the problem with science isn't that it's doing anything wrong per se. It's got the content right. It's got the content within the context right. But then it doesn't take into account the context at a bigger picture. It's good at technical details, but not the big picture. So I'm not saying that science is going to lose its validity because of what I said. No. The problem, the major problem with science is that most scientists take it for granted that their discoveries is objective and that they hold the crown to truth with a capital T. But in fact, all scientific understanding and discoveries are metaphorical and interpretive. They're never literal. They're never actual. Just like how, you read the Bible and you say, okay, the Bible has some good points, but it's not literal. It's metaphorical. And the same analogy could be applied to science. the theories and the symbols and the words and even the relativity, the theory of relativity, is not really the actual essence of reality. That's apart from the mind. It is a metaphorical way of interpreting reality. In fact, any type of thinking that you make about reality can only be metaphorical and interpretive, because reality is beyond thought. The absolute is beyond the mind. It's beyond interpretation. It's beyond thinking altogether. So the only way to arrive at truth with a capital T is not through thinking or formulas or theories. Is to become reality itself. Is to connect with the reality. To be non-dual yourself. And you see that reality is one. But to do that, you have to strip away every single program and dogmas of the mind. And of course, including the scientific dogma and the scientific programming. And people might be like, how can you be so presumptuous as to say that we can know reality and we can become reality? I think you can. Of course you can. The stuff that makes up you is the same stuff fundamentally that makes up reality. And so all you have to do is get in touch with the essence of yourself to be reality and to get to the essence of reality. So you have to be reality. You can't understand reality. And you really have to have an experience of the absolute at the experiential level, even for just 2 seconds. It would sort of destroy your entire ideologies and assumptions about science and almost everything else that you think you know or believe about the universe, about consciousness, about existence. In another context or another meta matrix that science is filtered through is the lens of expertise, actually, and the lens of the ego and the lens of validation. That runs counterintuitive to what you might think, because like many people, I used to really admire people with PhDs and people that are doctors and things like that. And don't get me wrong, I still admire those people. But again, going deeper, expertise could be a trap. See, although experts at their own field, many academias are relatively dogmatic and close-minded to anything outside of their immediate domain of knowledge and dismiss anything that poses threat to their identities and collective egos as scientists, as physicists. And like any other organism, science's ultimate goal isn't always and necessarily truth with a capital T, but self-preservation and validation. So in a sense, the more prestigious and specialized your degree is, and that's funny because again, most of the time we think the more specialized, the more technical you are, the more truth you carry, but not always. The more you're thinking this way is confined to a paradigm. The process of acquiring a PhD, takes a large amount of consensus, peer reviews, mutual agreements from colleagues and supporters who are quote unquote members of your own tribe. So science is almost like a tribe in a sense, if you look at it from that perspective, right? And it's bound to corruption just like religion. And this presupposes high order of conformity. So many experiments and patents are actually funded by capitalists who are solely interested in their own profit and expansion and are only sort of keen on truths, relative truths with a small t, that benefit and reaffirm their own agendas and ideologies. This is why you see so many TED Talks that got banned. What are those TED Talks that I banned have in common? They all talk about ways to alter your consciousness or psychedelics, methods to have glimpses into the absolute, methods that could break apart the scientific matrix. And with that said, don't get me wrong, I love science just as much as the next guy, and I will never let anybody who doesn't have a spleen MD to operate on my spleen, or I will never let anyone to operate on my teeth if they're not a dentist with a degree. And without some scientific background and knowledge, spiritual practices can quickly be self-sabotaging. And one's pursuit for truth can be quickly turned into new age woo-woos and mumbo-jumbos like what the bleep do we know in The Secret. when spiritual gurus who don't have any scientific background at all, who don't understand the mind at all from the scientific perspective, start getting into yoga, kundalini, and they still having experiences and they don't know how to interpret it, and they can really become sort of demonic, and have friends who have experiences like that, and it's really scary. And they start to think that there's some kind of deities, and they're seeing like angels and gods and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that science and spirituality really do sort of need each other. And the reason why the materialistic scientific matrix is the hardest one to break out of is because so much about gadgets, comfort, and capitals are dependent on it. Like even the people who are like, a lot of people get offended when anytime somebody talks shit about science. Well, duh, because the most of our matrix is built by science. See, again, science is good at creating, explaining phenomenons within its own matrix. It's good at creating the stuff of the dreams from the stuff of the dreams. Like, how do you get your iPhone? How do you get my computer? How do you get my cars? How do you get this house? Through mathematical formulas, which are dreamed up by mathematicians and scientists. And they use this dream element, the equations or whatever, to build stuff of the dream. All this is the dream, right? And there is a way to escape from this dream. But it's not science's best interest to do that, to be unplugged from the very container that created it in the first place.
Oh my god. Holy shit. What the fuck?
See, another element that scientists take for granted, that they take on blind faith and build their entire paradigm out of, is the fact that they think the brain produces consciousness. This is kind of like the first example I gave about how science take on blind faith and presupposes that the underlying structure of reality is matter. It's the same thing pretty much. But this is more from a neuroscientist perspective. There's no evidence at all that the brain produces consciousness. Once your consciousness starts to have direct experiences of itself, it becomes super crispy clear that there is no evidence at all that matter, brain, produces consciousness. The brain is not the producer of consciousness, but consciousness is the producer of the brain, the body, the mind, and the world. Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, again, like the God Delusion. In Dan Dennett, he wrote a book about consciousness called Consciousness Explained. Like, that's just my assumption. Like, I don't know their subjective experience. I'm not gonna, I can't say for sure. But based on the interviews and their writings, I don't think they've had any experiences with altered states. This is what they're doing is exactly like writing about analyzing sheet music for your entire career without having to hear the music itself or play an instrument. See, science can keep doing its thing, like the way they're doing it now. But if they start to be a little bit more conscious and apply meta-awareness and start incorporating consciousness work into their work, I think science is going to, have a quantum leap, and our whole civilization is going to reach a new singularity. Because even if you escape the matrix of science, you can still come back and be a scientist. You're going to be an even better scientist. It's almost like you escape the matrix, you wake up from the dream, but then you don't abandon the dream. You come back to the dream world and you start lucid dreaming, and everything starts to flow more smoothly, and you sort of can not escape, but you can sort of like loosen the grip of things like validations and egos and things that sort of would affect and distort your scientific experiments and discoveries. And the whole scientific paradigm would be more conscious and more humane and less robotic and less about like just chopping reality and fitting into little categories, the static, robust way of doing science. The fusion of spirituality, which is really inner science, and Western material science should really meet, and they are already starting to meet. But in the next 100 years, I think they're going to be the one and the same thing. They're going to be non-dual. And that's when civilization is going to reach a new quantum leap. That's when things are going to really start to be interesting. Because what is meditation but the purest form of science? It's empirical. See, okay, science prides itself on its methods of empirical, direct observation, rigorous methods of investigation, right? But like I said before, all that presupposed elements are filtered through many lenses. But meditation is not filtered through anything at all because it's investigating your direct experience right now. It's empirical and it incorporates rigorous methods of investigation into the nature of your own consciousness, which is the only thing that you have, which is the thing that's missing in most scientific inquiries. It's almost like a blind spot. Like they use consciousness to probe at reality. Like Stephen Hawking said, I'm going to understand the mind of God through a telescope by looking outward. When in fact, he should be doing that inwardly as well. And if he does that inwardly, the outside and inside would collapse when you get to the bottom of it.
You walk out.
And then he realizes that by understanding your own consciousness, not only can you understand reality better, you become reality, like I said before.
Would you like me to navigate
So
you?
any knowledge that you've come to gain in regards to the brain or the world, like, this part of the brain lights up when you think about penis, and this part of the brain lights up, this kind of chemicals gets produced in your synapses when you think about a waterfall. That's just a matter of correlation between that experience and the mechanism of the brain. It's just a correlation. Again, interpretive, not actual. And it's the third party belief that's inferred from another source, like textbooks or the videos that you watched, things people told you about the brain, from PhDs. They're just ideas and beliefs that you've collected that you take to be true, but it's not an experiential fact. It's not truth with a capital T. So Richard Dawkins said that in his book, The God Delusion. I remember this sentence very well. I used to agree with it a lot. I used to tell people, this is the quote: "You have to be open-minded, but not so much that your brain falls out." But I think that's exactly what needs to be done. Thoughts are not stored inside heads any more than the aesthetics of Arnold are stored inside his biceps. See, when I talk to someone, there is no sense that her thoughts are inside her head any more than my thoughts about her thoughts are inside mine. Even if I cut open the skull and see a 3-pound jelly and show it to you, what is that but another perception, another thought, another image? So the brain, quote unquote brain, is not an organ that produces images, again, concepts or hallucinations, but is in of itself just another image, another concept, another hallucination. And from the phenomenological perspective, the relationship between the brain, the body, and the world are not matters of physical causations like scientists presume, but they're all just coming from the same holographic projection. They're just emptiness manifested as different forms, salsa dancing alongside each other inside God's infinite dream.
Take these niggas to the zoo.